One of the most important things we need to worry about is how do you collect impression type evidence and make sure that you're going to do a good job in not destroying the evidence before it gets to the lab. So there's a couple of different things. So of course we might be collecting the firearm itself. We might be collecting a bullet or a cartridge that was spit out from a firearm. We might be collecting an impression of a tool mark or a footprint or a tire tread. See what else? Do I have them all? I think I've got them all. So, or, oh well, and the gunshot residue has its, we sort of already talked about that special swab kit that you use. So if we're collecting a firearm, one of the most important things, of course, is safety first, right? We want to make sure that that firearm is not going to damage anyone in transit. So it must be rendered safe. And of course, we want to be very careful. Firearms are great places to collect fingerprints because you have to hold the gun. So often there can be latent prints recovered off of a firearm. So you want to be very careful about not touching areas where they might be able to recover a fingerprint. So the checkered portion of the grip, where it's not going to hold a fingerprint anyways, would be an okay. Or the trigger guard is the two places. If you go back and look at a picture, you don't want to put a pencil through. Never put a pencil in the barrel, right? Putting a pencil in the barrel could damage the striation, the markings that get made on the bullet when you fire the test bullet. So you don't want to do anything to the barrel, and you do want to be very careful about the trigger guard area. So, of course, you want to render it safe. Make sure it is not possible for it to discharge. So you want to unload it. Sometimes they have gun locks that can work in place. Occasionally, you get a gun that maybe is corroded or rusting and it is not possible to render it safe. In that case, you want to make sure that you're securing it in a particular type of box for unsafe guns, especially steel box. If you have a revolver, remember revolvers have that revolving chamber which can hold generally 6 bullets. It's important to record which chambers had bullets in them still and their positions and all that, but then that before you discharge it and unload it, you'd want to make sure and document all of that, especially with photographs. And then you want to mark it for identification. So typically, we want to make sure that the gun is going to be in a situation where maybe it might get separated from its case information. So having a tag directly on it helps with that. So usually we tag the trigger guard itself so we know what's going on, and then secured in a container so that the fingerprints are not lost in transit. This is an example of how we might package a firearm. If you remember the packaging project, I did a demonstration with a knife and you could kind of see how you can use zip ties in a box. Now we wouldn't want to pack this with any kind of cushioning because that might destroy the latent fingerprints or any trace evidence that was left on the gun, so we'd want to leave it kind of secured but not touched where anything can rub against it. The bullets themselves, of course, we're less worried about trace evidence being on the outside of them that can be wiped off. We are worried about those striation markings and making sure nothing happens to them. We don't want them getting scratched up or mutated in transit. So we would want to put these in some kind of tissue paper or some kind of cushioning inside a pill box so it can't really move around, and that would help protect it a little bit. For tool mark evidence, ideally, we want to take the entire impression and bring it to the lab. That would be an ideal situation. So, if a tool was cut into, a knife mark was into, obviously sometimes a person, but also sometimes something in a home that could be picked up and brought in, we would do that. If a hammer gets hit into the wall and there's an impression left in the wall or in a door jamb, that's not the kind of thing you can send to the lab. If that's the case, then we could send that, we could take a casting of it, and that would be an acceptable alternative. But the casting needs to be as detailed as possible to try to recover some of that information. Never, never, never put the tool into the tool impression to see if it fits. that's a huge no-no, because of course in that case we are cross-contaminating. So now once that's been done, the integrity of that piece of evidence is now questionable. So we don't know if you transferred information when you were doing the fit, or whether the transfer of materials happened at the commission of the crime. So never, and of course it could actually even disturb the impression mark so that it no longer shows what we need it to show to make a match. Casting impressions, so it's really like, it's kind of like making regular things. So it's a two-part epoxy generally, sometimes it's rubber, sometimes it's silicone, but a two-part mix that's going to be mixed in on site and then smoothed into place and pressed into the impression, and leave to cure and set up. A lot of times you can leave that stick in it. Usually you have to stir it with a stick to kind of make the mix, and if you leave it in there and it casts in place, then you kind of have a handle to lift it off. Here's a website that kind of talks about casting impressions. There's a lot of different kinds of casting material, and that's going to depend on what your surface is and how much impression you have. You need something that's going to pick up a lot of the small detail, especially if we're trying to get some of those individual wear patterns to pick up on the cast. So we just had talked about the impressions from tool marks, but other things leave impressions too, right? We might have shoe or tire impressions, and before we do anything, we would always want to photograph it. So photograph first and then try to recover it. Again, if it's a print that's on an item where maybe it's on a floor tile and I can take the whole floor tile and send it in, then I want to transport that intact to the lab. If it can't be submitted to the lab, then we still might be able to preserve the print using a lift technique, kind of like lifting a fingerprint off of a surface, only this would be slightly different.